Hello, friends! Welcome to a new episode of the Building Resilience series. Today, we will think about organizations from a unique perspective, that of complex living organisms. My guest is a prominent management scholar, Daniel Levinthal, professor of corporate strategy at Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. We will reflect on the link between evolutionary biology and organizational resilience, whether today's cleverness will be good enough for tomorrow's crisis, why and how a mind of skepticism and renewal will keep us resilient. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and message me in the comment section below. Hello, Dan, and welcome to Building Resilience. I'm honored to be hosting you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
I've been reading your papers, and I'm looking forward to discuss some of the theoretical knowledge that you have, and I'm very curious in some insights, especially for 2020, and what we can do to really become resilient as organizations and as individuals as well. But first, just to have everyone a bit get to know you better, can you introduce your interest in studying organizations, and how did you start doing that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've reflected. In some ways, you kind of go way back to my backstory or origin story at some level. So my dad was a faculty member at Stanford, and as a byproduct of that, I grew up in the Silicon Valley of the 60s and 70s, which was kind of a special place, special time. This incredible creative engine of innovation and dynamic capitalism. And I think that at some level kind of imprinted a little bit both my interest in organization and the particular lens I take. And maybe it's worth kind of unpacking that a little bit, because I think it might introduce some of the other topics. So Silicon Valley is this amazing place, but it's not as if there's like some central planner who said, "Oh, the mayor of Silicon Valley, hey, in 1965, maybe we should do technology," and so on. What did it have? It had some good university. There's Stanford in the south, Berkeley in the East Bay. It had terrific weather, so people didn't mind moving there, living there. And I suspect, I was, young, mostly growing up in the 70s, older siblings of the 60s. A certain cultural zeitgeist of let's challenge norms, whether it's how one lives, maybe how you build organization. And it's interesting you kind of think about that history in a more concrete way. So I think it's interesting to take two touchstone firms, the obvious one and a completely non-obvious one. Okay. The obvious is Hewlett-Packard. So Dave Packard, Bill Hewlett, graduate Stanford. Their advice is, maybe I ought to stick around, start a firm, and make it okay. And it becomes this iconic firm that continues in some form to this day and develop both technology management practices. But a different firm is Shockley Semiconductors. So William Shockley is the innovator of the transistor at Bell Labs in New Jersey. He innovates and decides, I'm a little miffed at Bell Labs. Why don't I move back to Palo Alto? Nice area, good weather. I'll start a firm. That is the actual first semiconductor firm. It is a complete failure. It turns out Shockley, yes, brilliant scientist, but it turns out he's actually truly crazy. He's literally paranoid. He has employed lie detector. He's avowed racist with all sorts of bizarre ideas. So pretty much everybody leaves his firm. And they start a firm called Fairchild. And a few years down the road, Fairchild Semiconductors, core employees, Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, they leave and start something called Intel. So I think what's kind of intriguing is, to paraphrase Homer and talking about Helen of Troy, Shockley Semiconductor is like, the failure that launched 1,000 ships, right? And I think this idea of failure begetting kind of progeny, yes, we have success, but overall it's this kind of interesting flux and trauma. And in my work, at some level, I try to take that kind of sensibility, but bring it inside organizations. So Silicon Valley is this sort of macro phenomenon. At the population level, things are being born and they die. And I try to bring a little bit of that sensibility of, organizations, they renew, they have initiatives. Last year we were doing this, this year we're going to be doing something else. And so this idea of sort of the organization of these systems as complex adaptive systems. Local rationality, people trying to be clever, but nobody really designing the system, but in aggregate, possibly having some interesting collective and properties, and particularly collective adaptive properties. So I kind of feel like there might have been some subliminal imprinting that is, with the latency effect kind of, this is how I think about the world.
And where did the interest in learning and adaptation come from? You might have just chosen leadership, right? Following the example with semiconductors.
Yeah, so there's happenstance of one's lived experience. So I think I maybe more about me than needed to be, but I started out in economics, and partly as somebody who liked formalism, think about social systems. And I lucked out or got exposed to the work of Jim March, who was an eminent scholar, sort of founding figure, to be able to hear the firm. And so sort of Jim's particular intellectual imprint, it resonated. Oh, yes, firms are adaptive. That's the challenge that I want to kind of think about. And again, if we go back to the Silicon Valley imagery, that is, the neoclassical model is we have these rational actors who are solving problems, and we know we identify behavior through identifying some equilibrium. That's not the lived experience or the what seems to be going out there. And so I moonlighted with Jim, and I kind of left the mother church of economics and kind of became a behavioralist, but in particular a behavioralist, but also influenced by these ideas of complex adaptive systems. So it kind of resonated. That's kind of my journey.
How did you get to the influence of evolutionary biology?
Yeah, so I think a couple of respects. So there's their particular imprint of academic forefathers, people like Nelson and Winter, and their work in economics. There'd been this exciting work, 90s at Santa Fe Institute, complex adaptive system. But to circle back to your agenda, resilience, less about me, more about you and your viewers. Evolutionary biology has been working on the resilience problem for some 4 billion years. Okay. There might be something to be learned there. And this sort of challenge of a dynamic open system, entities engaged in some mixture of competition and mutualism. Well, that's kind of the evolutionary biology problem. And again, what's the alternative broad conceptual framework I might use? I could, my starting point in economics. Well, that, particularly for me as a theorist, microeconomics kind of approaches by the sort of dirty secret of microeconomics is you assume the world is sufficiently simple that I can characterize behavior. I can characterize the optimism. Economics, you're saying why biology or biology? Well, economics, if you look at its early history, quite clearly borrowed from Newtonian physics. And in physics, instead of solving for the low energy state, you solve for the maximum, utility or profits. So there was an arbitrage from sort of simple Newtonian physics to the problem of economic organization. And at some level, I'm suggesting, well, maybe a different arbitrage. Maybe the arbitrage, not obviously the literal sense that individuals have a kind of capacity for thought, foresight, anticipation, a microism is not going to have. But as a general orientation of sort of challenges of sort of emergent path dependence and multi-layer selection processes kind of sound to me a little bit like the organizational challenge.
You already started to introduce the subject of resilience, and definitely this is why we're here today. So how do you view organizational resilience through the lens of learning, adaptation, and evolutionary biology?
Yeah, so, part of the fundamental resilience problem is, we need to eat and survive today, but we also have to kind of figure out ways to operate in some proverbial future tomorrow where circumstances indeed might be different. And that's a dual challenge that kind of evolutionary systems and organizations, right? And so one imagery that's often adopted in this kind of line of thought that I operate with, this idea of the dual challenge of exploring and exploiting. We're kind of both making money. We have ways of doing things that kind of work today, but we're of two things. To paraphrase Voltaire, we haven't figured it out. We're not in the best of all possible worlds, but at the same time, the environment is shifting. But we need to both kind of leverage existing capabilities, ways of earning a living, at the same time open to new possibilities. And that seems to me kind of core to the resilience challenge.
Would this be the final goal as well of resilience? I've been asking this of everyone because in my view, when you talk about something that you need to achieve, you also need to understand how that would look like in the end. Did you reach that goal or not? How does it look that you have finally achieved resilience? How would it look in your view?
Yeah, it's interesting the way, as I reflect on the way you phrase that. So, I'm going to give an answer you may like your contrarian point of view, which is, I don't think there's not an end goal, okay? 2020, we have a pandemic. 2023, there's some environmental crises. So there's going to be a constant flow of challenge. We're living in this kind of dynamic open system. So so we have processes that may enable and facilitate, and organizations may have certain characteristics that kind of lend the resilience. But so we get a partial gold star for surviving this crisis. But was that luck? Was that chance? Was it cleverness? And is that cleverness going to be the right kind of cleverness for tomorrow's crises? So I think in some ways, in being a kind of, Andy Grove, one of those people who left their child to find intel at a kind of popular management book, only the paranoid survive. That may be slightly overstating the case, but this idea that we'll never get too comfortable. Okay, we've never quite figured it out, and we don't quite know what's coming. So it's that more of that sensibility, I guess, that I would encourage, which is somewhat different orientation.
But going back to your theory, whether it was luck or chance or just cleverness, it's still good we are getting through it, and those who managed to thrive at the end of this crisis would have learned something. Even those who failed should have learned something and be better in the other, if another crisis hits.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think, but there's also, we can think about some sort of kind of deconstruct that. It seems really in two ways. Okay. So one way in which we may have done okay was, and I think quite common, we had some latent initiatives, or part of what we did turned out to be useful in this challenging environment. We're scaling our takeout delivery. Zoom is taking off. So there's certain things taking off. There's a more subtle way, which I think you're kind of referencing, which is we have processes, we have a mindset that facilitates us creatively in a fairly short span of time, repurposing our initiatives, our people, our products in ways that are consonant with the current environment we're shifting. So I think it's kind of useful to distinguish between the sort of, in some sense, the content that we had kind of laying around, and processes and ways of managing that are kind of agnostic or independent of the particular crises. And whether it's been pandemic, climate change, what have you, those sort of higher level processes are what's going to kind of perhaps give some level of confidence about resilience in what may come down in future challenges.
But now you've made me very interested, and I'm very curious about your insight on 2020, on adaptation and learning. How do you see this year from your lenses? Did organizations adapt? Where did they fail? Could we have done better? What can we do to learn from this?
Well, yeah, let me engage or begin to get my toes into this, okay? First, I think at some level, there's lots of 2020 challenges, okay? There's sort of, profound demand shocks to many products and services and a lot of pain associated with that. The other shock is to how we go about our lives, how we operate in organizations, why you see me at my home and I see your home. Okay, so that's kind of about work practices, and include the shock with regard to both those. Let me kind of teeing up on the latter of those two about how we go about the business of work. I think at some level, I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding, and so at least my view, some of the discourse around that. So I think the immediate concerns seem to be more of this sort of control loss. But it's worth bearing in mind, before the coronavirus, it wasn't as if we all worked in the same cubicle. Okay, so we've always been distributed, and yes, there's a matter of degree, but I think this kind of in the world of knowledge workers, walking the hallways and seeing whether your hard work may make sense if you're a laborer on a physical plant. As a knowledge worker, where you're looking at your friend's Facebook, where you're writing a memo, that's kind of observation equivalent. So again, I think the control loss issue really is not the challenge. Once we're in the knowledge world, we've been there already. And actually, in that regard, I think people say, "Oh wow, productivity's not really dropped." It turns out, people's lives are challenging, and they may have their children climbing on them during a Zoom call or something. But actually, that work. I think the challenge is, I think, a little more subtle, more downstream, which is, I think we have to be a little more careful about sort of what did co-location bias or gen bias. And I think for me, it is the innovation comes out of these creative recombination. It comes out of the unanticipated. So it's the hallway conversation. It's the after the meeting. Really, what did they mean? Well, where do you think we could go? It's lamenting to your colleague about your frustrations with the product or the project you're involved in, and then that kind of transforming into this brainstorming session. So I think our distributed 2020 life is fine for sort of, in some sense, exploiting. It's fine for kind of getting the work done. We can sustain established relationships. What it fails on, what it trades is sort of the non-structured, the non-predicted, the happenstance that serendipity coalition. So I think in the near term, from a kind of just how we manage, yes, it's complicated. We first had to set up our offices and so on, but that's kind of a hit. I think actually the hit will be a little bit downstream where, how come innovation sort of took a bit? How come we're sort of doing our same pathways? And I think you might also think about it in terms of like, wow, we onboarded these people, but they don't kind of get our corporate culture. Well, gee, you know what? That kind of happened over lunch or drinks after work. And so I think the sort of direct effects actually, it's profoundly impacting people's lives and it's incredibly challenging, but in this very narrow sense of, does the work get done and so on? Yeah, actually pretty darn good. But these other kind of aspects of, for newcomers, can they imbue the corporate culture? Are we coming up with these sort of interesting, creative, new initiatives? So I think there'll be a real latency effect, but a pretty significant one, a little bit down the road. And so I think we We may have learned the wrong lesson, but something circling back here is a more specific question. Like, oh, hey, we're resilient, the sausages are coming out of the sausage factory. We had to work out a few hiccups, but it's still going on. And we may find 18 months from now, whoa, we're really actually not quite as vibrant as we were previously. And it's not quite clear where sort of that next generation of whether employees or ideas are coming from. And so I think we have this kind of, back to sort of more generally about learning. Jim March and I wrote this piece some in my youth, the myopia of learning. Learning is driven by feedback, right? So the immediate cues in this context, we learn, we're resilient. We learn, we can really climb these hurdles. Well, the consequences that have some temporal delay are a little trickier to learn. They don't show up immediately. And to link, gee, why are the newcomers, not quite as engaged as people? Oh, maybe it's these young people, they're not like us. They grew up differently. So the attribution became a little more complex in the learning. What was it that why they didn't get acculturated? Why aren't we kind of coming up with quite the same rate of innovation we were previously? So that attribution process gets trickier when it's, that consequence outcomes are a bit delayed. So I think we've kind of they've learned a little bit of a false reassuring lesson.
How can organizations form this habit of reflection and understanding? Have we really done something good? Will this really lead to learning and adaptation and us getting better and thriving? Or is we were just lucky because we were in the right context at the right time and having the right people?
Yeah. So, you're sort of asking this sort of meta moment of sort of self-reflection in the after action. I suspect that breathtaking hasn't happened yet. Maybe post-vaccine, there'll be a kind of, let's take the corporate retreat. Let's kind of do, the military talks about after action reports. Okay, we were on the mission. Why did this happen? What could have happened differently? I'm not quite sure that sort of broader bandwidth is quite present. But I think a sort of general humility and modesty, right? That's again, we've never figured it out. Okay, formally, in computational theory, these are non-solvable problems. There is no ideal organizational form. This is kind of working, but I think this sort of modesty of it's kind of working, but it can be different. And today's challenges may say we want to kind of highlight certain kinds of relationships, certain kinds of ways in which reporting is happening, and it's imperfect, but it's kind of highlighting what's sort of focal now, but have to be recognizing that, in some future, open to sort of changing and revisiting it. So I think this kind of, broader sense of kind of continual renewal. And I think per your observation, we can think about renewal at multiple levels of analysis, right? There's the renewal of the particular products and services we offer 18 months from now, maybe different than we offer today. But then there's sort of the structural renewal. We thought the divisional form made sense. We thought these reporting relations made sense. They kind of did, but they were imperfect. And not to kind of, was the former a bad idea? Was it flawed? It was probably a reasonable structure for that time. And these kinds of tweaking reinventions are actually what a healthy system does. So back to sort of there is no endpoint. There is no gold star, you're resilient. It is a kind of, red queen, what the biologist said, okay? The red queen and Alice, I'm running fast. Why I'm running fast? So I can stand still. Okay. And organizational bylaw is a little bit of that challenge. Throw yourself a party on Friday afternoon, have a beer, the quarter went well. But Monday morning, we're sort of back to, okay, but are our markets changing a little bit? Does this need tweaking? Really, was this right? So I think this kind of eternal skepticism, which can be kind of annoying. It's not the easy way to live. And you need to both kind of feel good about what you've accomplished, but not sort of excessively comfortable.
And then we're talking about experimentation. And this is one of the key elements, not only in your work, but everyone I've been talking to about resilience until now has been talking about experimentation as key. And some organizations, and we were just talking just 5 minutes before we started, some organizations understand better how to do this, like you take the Googles and the Facebook, who have the data and who have the analytical capacity and understanding that they need to experiment. Yeah. And allow for, 20% off from their right. employees, so they can experiment themselves, really understand, hey, is this a good idea or not, and then it gets implemented. Whereas still a lot of organizations don't do it. With some that I speak with, working in HR, they don't really understand how to grasp the idea, and when they decide to run experimentations, they change so many factors that you cannot draw any kind of conclusion at the end. Right. So my conclusion is that they don't know how to do it. Some of them, they don't even think about it.
Yeah.
So you have been writing and talking about experimentation for a long time. How can organizations learn how to do that? Where should they start? And how should they think about experimentation? Maybe in a simpler way, in a way that they can start doing it and learn while they do it?
Yeah, so it's a really fascinating set of issues. And as you say, kind of enormous kind of management challenges. And I think one useful entry point is just to recognize the different sorts of quote experiments. Okay, and I think we kind of conflate, part of we get in trouble by kind of conflating things at that level. So first, there's the A/B trial. Okay, so Amazon, Facebook, gee, we could present you with this kind of screen, the font size, these cues, these imageries, and we can see how people respond. And as you were suggesting, that kind of like the science experiment. We really have a, control. These are random populations, and we can kind of do that. And that's really powerful, useful. But that's at a very operational level. Okay. Amazon is not experiencing, how about we start creating our own movies? Those are strategic initiatives. So we kind of, we sometimes, I think, extrapolate from a very well-defined, clear experimentation of the A/B trial at that level of granularity to these broader, more strategic initiatives and so on. So I think among the important kind of distinctions there, which I know the feedback and learning. So, it's unambiguous. You did the trial, 10,000 customers, they respond in different ways. Now we'll try this. Versus the more HR challenge. Okay, so we're doing a quote experiment. We're going to have you spearhead this new initiative. Well, let's pause. Okay, in many ways, that's different than the A/B trial. The A/B trial, the success of that initiative, it's hard to unpack. Did it fail because intrinsically it just wasn't that great idea? Or you know what? If you worked a little bit harder, if you were a little bit more clever, maybe it would be successful. So sometime back, Ron Adler and I did a piece a while back about kind of critiqued or the management literature enthusiasm with this idea of real options. And so in a real option, the financial option, the price of Google would have you, or Tesla, that's independent of whether I decided to put some money down and buy the option. Okay. The A/B trial, it's kind of exogenous. It set it up and it did it, and people responded. But then when you get to these more sort of substantive managerial initiatives, as you say, it's not a controlled experiment. Okay. We're taking a risk. We're trying. And exactly as you're sort of intimating on the HR side, upper management, it may look like, oh, we got a bundle of options. For you as that manager, it's not a bunch of options. It's your life. It's your career. Okay, your prospects of that organization depend upon how that thing is evaluated. And so it's vastly more complicated. So I think we kind of trivialize the problem often by, oh, it's like a financial option. It's like these A/B trials. No, it's a vastly more complicated where, it is a joint consequences of merit, energy, talent. And so we have these kind of evaluation challenges. Among the other kinds of things is, it didn't work out, but we discovered maybe B or C could be kind of interesting, right? And that's another way, which is different from option. Option is either we're in the money, we're going to exercise our option. Most initiatives are partial failures, partial successes. So how do we sort that through? And to make it, again, even trickier is people's lives, the career consequences around that. I had a PhD student a while back, Ishan Guler, did have examined these issues in what should have been like, in some ways, is the easiest context. She looked at venture capitalists. And she studied, the challenge they have in terminating these ventures, And again, compared to a corporate context, these are not people they hang out in the lunchroom and so on. They're supposed to be the tough love venture capitalists. And she found them sort of going back and refunding ventures that sort of by pretty, reasonable objective measures, probably not a good idea. The conditional probability of seeing it. And she found, that the capacity to terminate was a big driver of the rate of return of these ventures. You're not throwing good money after bad. You're repurposing these other ways. So even in the sort of relatively easy context where it's external, it's not easy to sort of say, oh, it doesn't have this future possibility. I think the idea of pivot is interesting in this regard, both pragmatically and psychologically, because the pivot is both, it's saying two things at some broad level. It is both, you know what, it didn't work out, but it wasn't this complete abject failure. Okay, we're leveraging something. I mean, to be maybe in a silly way, somewhat literal. A pivot is not a leap. Okay, a leap is like, let's just try something profoundly new. No, it's 1 foot. I think we emphasize the delta, the change. But the other side of it is the continuity. That there was something about that technology. We did kind of have something here, or some aspects of the market kind of got what we were up to. There's something that we can leverage, but we're not a prisoner of this sort of like, corporate plan. This is what we're going to do. And so it allows for a kind of finders, but it's not an experiment either. Okay. It is not like, Louis Pasteur with his test tubes or something. Okay. It is it's a journey. There's an openness to the feedback, the learning, the ways in which we adapt. And I think, so I think organizations do both. It seems to me, to circle back, at a lower operational level, we can run experiments. Here it is clean. This device works better than this. This way we present our website. We tune the algorithm. We're getting better traction this way. Those truly are experiments. But a lot of what we do inside organizations are, let's try some new initiatives. It's not kind of our current way of doing. It's not our current kind of product or services. But we think we can take some of our skills, take some of our people, and kind of go in this other direction. And then, okay, how do we evaluate it? And again, one of the, I think, really difficult challenges of kind of the management is this piece about evaluation. And so one of the things that I push from my sort of metaphoric evolutionary lens is one of the key roles of management in some sense is to serve a sort of selection buffer. Okay. the market feedback, most new ventures, you're losing money, but we think we're developing an interesting product. We think we're getting customers. So you create milestones. You sort of, yes, the market isn't responding. They're not snapping up our new device, but we see, and that's kind of, I talk about the market, the organization as an artificial selection environment. We have the sort of financial and commercial markets, the product markets that are buying, selling, evaluating. But in this kind of ecosystem as a firm, you get to pick up your own rules. Now, it might be delusional. You reach a couple of ways that kind of lead you adrift. But it may be that we see these hints of gradients of progress in ways that are not going to be expressed in kind of market outcomes. And so it's all this piece of a very, complex process. And again, I think by trivializing it in some ways, and again, not that experiments are happy, but the thing at that time, we're missing that. And as you alluded to, say, the 20% time rule of Google, which actually they took from 3M from a couple of decades earlier, right? I think that's really interesting in this regard because, that's giving slack and saying, you know what, you're this interesting engineer. 20% of your time, what do you think might be an interesting, provocative idea? Maybe Gmail will make sense. But I think we still have to recognize that delays the selection and resource allocation decision. It doesn't eliminate, right? So at a certain, but it's really important, right? Instead of going into the vision head and saying, I have this idea for Gmail and it's this, complete whiteboard ideation thing, you might be able to come in with a working prototype and this is how it can link and this and so on. And so there's a little bit of credibility. And so it's really valuable. But at the end of the day, there still needs to be, I'm going to give you the resource, the engineers and so on to do this at scale, to make this a reality. So it I think nicely illustrate this kind of open up to this sort of exploration kind of initiative, but at the same time recognize it doesn't solve fully the problem. It allows the sort of initiative to be further down the road, maybe understood in kind of a more insightful kind of informed way. But ultimately, that internal selection has to happen. And it's pretty unlikely that your 20% time activity led to some commercial outcome where you could just say, people are gobbling this off the shelves. It's likely that you still are operating in this kind of internal selection environment. So I think this kind of, and I know part of your viewership, the interest on the HR side, I think is enormously important in these regards, right? This kind of, this again, the career con, what does it mean? It didn't work out, and we understand that it didn't work out, and whether it's a pivot or you're going to repurpose in other ways, and that there's sort of a sense of goodwill, but obviously that can't be balanced. Okay, the pivot, requires a couple of things. It requires, yes, we acknowledge that trajectory didn't quite work out, and a kind of faith and confidence about that new path. But after 4 or 5 pivots, presumably that faith and confidence should in fact start diminishing, and maybe there's something about the actor's judgment, and it's not just this sort of bad luck outcome. But that's a really difficult challenge to navigate. And I think actually, in that regard, I think it's interesting, it seems to me, why perhaps pivots work well in the small organization. It might be more challenging in the larger established firm, because in the small, we're all around the same table or the same Zoom call. There's a high level of communication, high level of trust. We're on the same page. Even if there is an outside venture capitalist, they're on 25% of those Zoom calls. There's some shared understanding. Inside a larger entity, I think that shared understanding be more challenging. Did the higher ups 2 levels up, maybe 1 level up, kind of truly get the challenges and the ways in which this sort of worked, sort of did, why there's a logic. It wasn't me, being inept as carrying out this initiative. And so I think that kind of flexibility, and it's a kind of interesting irony because at some level, repurposing, you're the big corporation of scale and scope. There's so many ways you could go. So lately you think, oh, that's the perfect context for these wonderful pivots. But I think this sort of literal and psychological recontracting are probably a little bit harder as the people you're recontracting with are a little more distant from the underlying initiative. And so I think it's a really interesting open question. It's sort of a 64 billion euro or dollar kind of issue that we really don't have a good glimmer on, because I think we tend to trivialize the challenge. But I suspect that's part of why we see it in the small and see it being so effectively in the small, and I think see less evidence of it in the established entity, which is sort of looking for clear metrics by which to make these decisions versus a more trust-based, more grounded, phenomena-based discussion about the particulars of the content.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why the more established companies are supporting smaller companies, smaller startups to grow. And if the initiative in the end, and they culturally as well, and if they are fit, then they will be part of the bigger organization. They will swallow them at some point.
Absolutely, right. And so, they let that pivoting happen. And then when it's pretty clear, in fact, the working prototype actually works. We can operate at this scale, link it to our products and technologies. So, the big, and that's why, I think the larger, it can take multiple bets. But a bet versus a pivot is a single trajectory that kind of zigzags. A bet is, I took N bets, some set of them work, some don't, and then I walk away the table. So the small, we only have a few resources. There are only 8 of us. Either we're vectorized on programming this application or we're doing this other one. So it kind of is an interesting contrast between this sort of we sort of have to be focused to get anything out the door, but because we're operating in this more linked way and more, we actually do have this sort of the social trust to pivot, and the large kind of, we took some seed money and a bunch of ventures. Some of them will work, some of them don't, and we're operating at more distance. So they are kind of different ways of engaging that work for the different kind of enterprises.
Then, do you see some enemies to resilience? Some things or some mindsets that maybe you can pinpoint and say, this is definitely not going to help you thrive in adversity?
So one thing, and again, maybe I'm pitching more to your, probably thinking about some of your audience at a psychological level, something I talk less about my work, but I think it's really important is it framed as a threat or as an opportunity? So, we have to do belt tightening. Okay, fine. That's not fun, but we kind of get that. The opportunity, both framings are going to have a reality. The opportunity framing is, we think about our current crisis and challenges. There's been systemic change to the online world. Okay, there's been systemic change in distributed work. The coronavirus is a massive accelerant to those changes. So, the opportunity framing is what? Let's get ahead of the curve. The world is moving this way anyway. Now we're really forced, and let's really own these changes that we sort of had some glimmer of, but we were successful enough that we didn't really have to confront. And let's not think about it as a kind of a blip, but we're never going to fully snap back. This is the time we're going to really hunker down and think about how we change ourselves for the way that technology and these platforms are moving us. And both are going to happen, and both are challenging, but I would say the opportunity frame is like, well, a little more positive, right? Like, okay, I see a future. I can be creative. It's not just purely the downsizing and letting go. So I think looking for sensitive to those alternative framing is important. I mean, so if we purely code it as a threat, it's both demoralizing and it's not going to be ultimately well positioned. You may survive in the moment, but you're not going to be that well positioned in 2021 because in fact, this is even post-vaccine going to be a different environment. I think, sort of hubris kind of attitude that we actually truly do know what we're doing versus, yeah, we have a clue. We've got some pretty good practices, but a little bit of humility. And I think that's a helpful mindset, that we are always aware of kind of, there are better ways of doing it. And that's not saying we were incompetent, we were fools. That's just life in a complex system, and particularly a world that itself is changing. And so that's both a kind of a general sensibility to take. And so that young person who comes in the office, isn't annoying or not. This is what a healthy system does. And I think, part again, my biological imagery, we may live to a ripe old age of 100, but our cells are going through a constant process of renewal. We're not a fixed form. The reason we made it to 100 is through this constant renewal process at a cellular level. And sometimes we have it easy because while human beings are messing with our egos, our niche, and it's getting problematic for Homo sapiens, but that's a slow thing. But business organizations, we're just keeping our same form. Okay, maybe I lost some hair, but I still stand, and my limbs are still attached, doing pretty good. But business organizations are constantly having to both maintain form. People retire. I knew people who have the skills, sensibility, have our culture, and simultaneously operate in new environments. And so, again, to kind of more this mindset, yes, this is a bigger delta and it's happening in a bigger time, but this is sort of, at some level, would be more our baseline sensibility. And if you, to sort of adopt that as the baseline, a healthy organization is letting things go, is adopting new initiatives, and that's success. That's success as markers of resilience. And if we're operating that way, okay, we really got to speed that up in 2020. But at some level, that's kind of a bit of our mindset and orientation. And to say that versus the threat, the complacency, we figured it out, obviously, deeply problematic.
To pull it all together, you have a metaphor in one of your latest articles that talks about organizations as canvases on which actors create. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, actually, I was actually drawing from a journal I had at Strategy Science. We had a special issue which I deserved basically zero credit for, but I did. Well, in the spirit we're talking about, I found two really terrific people who had good ideas and said, "Oh, you have great ideas. Go ahead." So Violano Rendova and Elizabeth Pontikis are organization sociologists and who delve a lot about these ideas of kind of actors influencing their environments. And so, management professors sometimes wax poetic, we talk about shaping and so on. But they as scholars, okay, how do you affect kind of institutional norms, practices? You're developing wind power. How do I convince people this is a good idea? How do I get the regulatory system on board? And so I wrote an intro to their lovely special issue and kind of offered a bit that imagery, in part because, again, I think part of the trick is back to the kind of, when we think about pivoting, when we think about exploration, exploitation, as learning guy, as evolution, it's this duality of taking the old and projecting the new, taking what's available and creating something new. It's not, what I object to and react negatively to is sort of it's not Franz Kafka metamorphosis. I went to bed as a man and I woke up as an insect. And sometimes our imagery is, no, there were sort of elements in the world and the organization, and you creatively repurposed it. And so the paint, the canvas, some of it out there, but you're the artist, you're the creative genius who put it together in a new way, and in their own particular way. Elizabeth and Ilona kind of tell that story, but I think in a variety of ways, whether it's kind of how I shape my institutional environment, the kind of initiatives as a business enterprise, as a social movement, or as managing that enterprise. But I think it is that interesting duality that good ideas. I've done work on analogical reasoning. What is that? It's like I take prior instance and I project it into the current context. So it's this kind of mapping, and there is this kind of old, new, re-leveraging in insight. And I think that back to resilience, right? That is, it's about leverage. If it's wholly new, whoa, I'm in trouble. And one of the lines I sometimes, talking to audiences, I think about, there's at one level of granularity, we can think about life as a series of unique events. We've never had this crisis. We didn't have the internet before. We don't have a pandemic. But I'm inclined as somebody who thinks about learning. Well, if I think about life as a series of unique events, I've never been on a Zoom call with you. Well, I think I'd end up in an insane asylum. I have to be able to sort of leverage prior insights. Okay, I've been in other Zoom calls. I've kind of chatted about work before. And yes, the pandemic is different, but how, when we face some other instances of crises, how did we reassemble? How did we respond? What did we do in the financial crisis? Are there any insights we can take from there? The internet is new, but you know what? We had TV broadcasting before. We had catalogs before. So we have to recognize a novelty, but in ways in which there can be some prior insights. Otherwise, it seems to me,
feedback and reflection.
That's the kind of dual mindset sensibility that I sort of encourage.
Then, is there something that maybe I didn't ask you and you would like to leave the audience with?
Buy my book. Opportunity Press coming out this summer. So my pulling on these themes and my sort of my metaphor, kind of device. I talk about an evolutionary perspective on adaptation and Mendelian perspective. And so, in the spirit of what we talking about, I'm maybe somewhat bastardizing and maybe not quite, it's not Mendel, but what I like about him as a imagery and as a kind of touchstone. So we have a couple big ideas about how things happen. Sort of a Darwinian process of this blind mutation and selection. We have these sort of godlike imagery of, strategists at the chessboard and moving their pieces around. And back to my, the gardener, the cultivation, the artificial selection environment, Mendel sort of I try to use him as a carrier for that image, right? So there's this, there's cultivation, there's intentionality, there's chance, and there's the gardener's renewal. And so I think it's a healthy mindset. I think there are particular practices and processes we could have in mind, but I think, that has an orientation, and it's uncomfortable, or I think in election, we're not inclined to do that. Economists tend to operate in the godlike realm. I think, we know what the Darwinian things look like. This is a sort of intermediate of kind of intentional rationality, in a multi-level system and how it might evolve and have some of these properties. So,
when will it be out?
May, June.
May, June. Okay. And what's the full title?
So, Evolutionary Perspective on Organizational Adaptation, and then Evolutionary Perspective on Organizational Adaptation, a Mendelian Perspective. Oxford University Press.
Will it be available on Amazon as well?
Probably not now.
No. Okay.
Well, hold your breath.
Okay. Perfect. But I will definitely ask you next year again, and maybe we can republish this discussion with the link. Exactly. Right. Exactly. I'm looking forward to it, by the way.
Okay. Well, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. It was beautiful.
Yes. For me, it was very, very interesting and very insightful. It's very good to talk with you. Very nice.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.